General Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, Thomas Cueni, and Vice President of Research for FP Analytics, Dr. Mayesha Alam.
Well, it's now my pleasure to be joined by Thomas Cueni, the Director General of IFPMA. Thomas, thank you so much for being with us today.
Very pleased to be with you.
Let's dive right in. I wanted to ask you first about the issue of equity when it comes to access to medicines. Now, the negotiations for the new pandemic treaty have generated debate about ensuring equitable access to future medical products and services across the globe, including not only in high and middle income, but also, of course, low income countries. So let me ask you this. How is IFPMA thinking about and working to prioritize equity in the treaty language? And how can we prevent gross inequities when it comes to PPE, therapeutics, vaccines, and other essential goods that emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Basically, when we look at lessons learned from COVID-19, I think innovation delivered. Access to pathogens unhindered was not new. Partnerships worked, but equitable rollouts didn't work as it should have done for a number of reasons. We need to make sure that in the pandemic treaty, we do not compromise what worked well. The ability to innovate, the fast response, the access to pathogens, but we do need to focus on equity. I see basically two avenues in terms of doing that. One is we have multiple initiatives for geographic diversity of manufacturing, in particular in Africa. Because of Prime Minister Modi shutting the border from one day to the next, didn't get the vaccine which COVAX, the partnership, had ordered from the Serum Institute of India. Therefore, we need to engage on better diversity of manufacturing, but that will take time. You do need the skilled workforce. You do need the functioning, strong regulatory system. You need sustainable demand in markets. And because that will take time, we also need an immediate fast response. And that's where we from the industry have joined forces with developing country vaccine manufacturers, but also with bio. And companies are committed to put aside part of real-time production for use and allocation by global organizations to people in low-income countries. The so-called Berlin Declaration, which we signed up to in June last year. I think that's a very down-to-earth pragmatic approach, but it will only work if the countries with manufacturing capacity allow exports.
Well, let me pick up on a couple of things that you just mentioned. Certainly the point about diversification of manufacturing and about regionalization are all really well taken. But there's also a related issue, I think, that's relevant here, and that's about intellectual property rights. So how would you address concerns that the pharmaceutical industry's stance on intellectual property rights may in fact impede global preparedness for future pandemics? And how do we achieve a balance between protecting intellectual property rights and addressing urgent health crises?
I beg to disagree. When we look at how innovation delivered, it was really on the basis of an old framework of partnerships. For example, last week in Geneva, we hosted a workshop on voluntary licensing and technology transfer, where we had pairs of innovators, licensors, and licensees from generic companies, developing country vaccine manufacturer. Each and every one of them, whether it's from South Africa, from India, from Latin America, from other parts of Asia, of the recipients, they emphasized this was based on knowing each other, on partnerships which had started years ago. It was based on going far beyond, the license of a patent which you can use, because know-how sharing, educating skilled workforces, helping companies to do the clinical trials. That's something which you really cannot coerce. And when you look in, for example, the vaccines field, mRNA vaccines were developed on the basis of 30 years trial and error. mostly trial and failing in oncology, and suddenly you had a breakthrough. This would not have happened, most of it, by the way, privately funded, risk funded. And the companies who came up, with the vaccines, tests, and treatments, who got us out of the pandemic, they signed up in more than 500 partnerships. My experience goes back 35 years. I've been involved in HIV/AIDS, actually exiting, pushing the industry to exit the lawsuit with South Africa. I've seen the debates about swine flu, about bird flu, where the issue of inequitable rollout was actually much worse than what we saw during COVID-19. Undermining, the system which led to the innovation, where, for example, more than 60% of the treatments used against COVID were repurposed. Companies looking into products they already had in use for patients where you could use compassionate use. All these voluntary partnerships would be jeopardized if you would enforce a waiver on patents. And it was interesting for me to listen to the generic manufacturer and the vaccine manufacturers from developing countries. Each and every one expressed concern about sustainable demand, about unlicensed competitors, about substandard counterfeit competitors. And each and every one of them, actually unsolicited, said the partnerships which we had were great, and they were voluntary, and they were built on trust, built up over years.
That's really interesting, and I think leads nicely to the next thing I wanted to ask you about. And you were mentioning swine flu and bird flu and a variety of other diseases that have led to multidimensional challenges, and in particular when we think about access to pathogens. The idea of countries having sovereignty over their genetic resources, including pathogens, is also a contentious one. And so let me ask you this. How should the global health community reconcile the need to share data on emerging pathogens in a timely manner with concerns about national sovereignty or potential financial benefits?
To be honest, there's a deep flaw in applying Nagoya access benefit sharing principles coming from the Convention on Biodiversity to pathogens. I must say, everyone I talk to on COVID-19, the issue of ABS, access benefit sharing, of benefiting or taxing companies who actually came up with the goods simply didn't occur. Whether it was from China, from South Africa with Omicron, from Brazil or other countries, scientists share, because this is very different from the biodiversity where you want to protect the richness of the fauna and flora. The Amazon rainforest is unique in the Amazon. Pathogens, number one. I haven't come across anybody who talks about need to protect the diversity of pathogens. You basically want to contain them, you want to eradicate as much as you can. And the benefit from sharing comes from the vaccines, the treatments, the tests developed. And also, they are ubiquitous. Omicron, if Dr. De Oliveira from South Africa would not have shared them with the GISAID data bank, it would have taken about 48 hours maximum before Omicron would have been sequenced in the UK or the US. Therefore, this is very different for CBD. The one point I really strongly agree, we need to come up with a solution to equity. We need to avoid the transactional model, which would hinder, delay access to pathogens, which would complicate the response which we have now. But we need to come up with a solid response on equitable rollout.
I really appreciate that last point, and thank you for bringing that up and giving such a comprehensive take on that issue. Before we wrap up, I want to definitely ask you also about the anticipation of and mitigating the risks of future pandemic threats. I know this is something that you are continuously engaged on, and something that I think is on the minds of many leaders in the global health community, in the international security community, in the development community. And obviously, this is a topic that's been on the agenda of the World Health Assembly this year, will be on the UNGA and elsewhere. So let me ask you this. While the COVID-19 pandemic has been declared no longer a public health emergency by the World Health Organization, experts have emphasized the importance of preparedness for future pandemics. And so, how does IFPMA envision its role when it comes to pandemic preparedness in the coming years? What actions is the organization currently taking or planning to take to mitigate these threats? And how are you trying to make the most of the inter-years, so to speak, between pandemics?
I personally believe, and IFPMA believe, that we need to start now when COVID hit the world unprepared, ill-prepared, and even some of the strongest healthcare systems in the world, whether it's France, Italy, UK, US, they suffered, from the lack of PPEs, the lack of preparedness. Therefore, we can't afford to do the same again. With that, looking at COVID, the ACT-A partnership was sort of building the plane while we were already on air, flying. Therefore, we really need to subscribe to this multi-stakeholder inclusive partnership with private sector at the table during the interim time. And then I see actually I'm pretty encouraged and feel optimistic. We see companies, for example, teaming up in pre-competitive research on antiviral, the Intrepid Alliance. We have partnerships with CEPI, the Coalition on Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation. We have a company, for example, agreeing with CEPI to work on prototype vaccines of priority pathogens. Before you know whether one of this will lead to it, we are involved in the 100-day mission. The first vaccine made it in 326 days from declaring of the pandemic to Margaret Keane getting the first jab in the arm in the UK. The aim to do this in 100 days is only possible if regulators who work 24/7 during the COVID pandemic look into what could we do even faster if companies actually already prepared in terms of scaling up, in terms of addressing pandemic threats. And we need to increase surveillance. We need to strengthen surveillances. And last but not least, we need universal health coverage. We need to have country readiness because by the time we had sufficient vaccines, the big problem was the nurses, the doctors were not there, vaccine hesitancy was a problem. We need to work on all of this now, jointly, multi-stakeholder partnership.
Thank you. That last point about universal health coverage and how UHC and pandemic preparedness are in many ways inseparable, I think is so important and often overlooked. So I really appreciate you underscoring that point. Well, Thomas, it's always a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate you making the time and your leadership. Thomas Cueni, Director General of IFPMA. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Next up, please welcome